So just to recap, what did the US and others do in Georgia's revolution and the other color revolutions? Well, what they did was quite limited, yet also instrumental. They provided technical and financial aid to local civic and political groups that challenged falsified elections. By technical aid, they helped locals gain the ability to do independent election monitoring, and they backed groups that could create a new degree of civic engagement in the electoral process. They also trained and provided material assistance to help opposition parties campaign more effectively and create broad coalitions. And these are typical pro-democracy aid sort of packages. I'm just making sure this is recording. Good. Now, some have referred to these various NGOs as society's delegates or trustee organizations that, quote, act on behalf of largely silent constituencies. But looking more closely, it's easy to see problems with these sorts of NGOs, which in closed or less developed societies are not surprisingly frequently top-down organizations. They have very small memberships. They're usually run by an even tinier group of initiators and leaders. And there are several problems with such organizations. First, in terms of sustainability, given the lack of domestic support base and expensive activities that they're engaged in, like publishing nice-looking books and fancy brochures, they're designed to influence external actors, the external donor community. Okay, they rely on their sustainability on external actors, and they gear their activities towards those external actors, which we'll talk about in more detail. And second, the relationship to the populace. They're often very distant from the population, again, in part as a result of their ties to the donors. The path of least resistance, what do they need to operate? They need money to operate. There's little or none domestically, and so they turn to foreign donors. To qualify for foreign grants, though, they must sometimes adjust their activities and even their goals. And this is known as resource dependency, which I mentioned before. Donors are caught in a trap as well. They often have access to a limited pool of quite homogenous organizations. So even where donors are discontent with their in-country partners, they might find that they have no other alternative partners. The problem is that more organic local organizations might exist. For example, there might be local, more informal organizations like neighborhood committees. But donors are actually discouraged from looking to sponsor them because they can't meet standard bureaucratic norms, standard Western bureaucratic norms, i.e. grant writing, right? You need to write grants in order to win them. And these grants have to be structured in a way that meets the Western bureaucratic demands. English language knowledge often is something that catches these organizations off guard. In her study of civil society development in post-communist Russia, for instance, Henderson describes the development of what she calls principled clientelism, where domestic NGOs concentrate their influence on foreign patrons rather than their natural constituents at home. And the result can be debilitating for organizations that are ostensibly fighting for democracy. What's democracy? Democracy is power to the people. But if these organizations are turned outwards, away from the people, how can they do this? These organizations usually don't even work with similar local organizations because they're actually competing with other organizations for a small pot of funding. They're writing grants competing against each other, which dissuades them from actually cooperating. There's often an incentive for lower level members in a given organization to defect from even that little organization to create their own organization where they can be on top with access to the funds. So you've got all these perverse incentives. Organizations don't want to cooperate with each other because they're fighting each other for the limited supply of Western money. And then within organizations, you get schisms and people breaking away to create their own organizations because they want to control the grants that come in. In other words, foreign support becomes a source of economic security and a battle zone. Just like what we saw in Chile, where the Chilean opposition was reborn in these foreign-backed NGOs because this was a way for them to continue their opposition activities in organizations that actually had some sort of support. Groups sometimes find themselves fighting with each other for more than, actually with each other more than with their own government. And it leads to isolated organizations rather than a vibrant civil society where everyone comes together. Even in Georgia, the case that we just talked about, where we found NGOs taking part in a movement for regime change, one can say that NGOs really failed to create the real civil society that they were ostensibly designed to create. Did they create strong interpersonal networks that could alter the shape of political discourse, facilitate citizen mobilization, and increase governmental responsiveness? Not for most of the time they existed. And when they did it, it was because society was so fed up with the process, and they leveraged society. They didn't create society. They didn't create society's angst. They didn't help foment society's angst. They helped to mobilize it at the end of the day. And one of the reasons for this was that donors were happy to award grant writers with hard currency, but this created NGOs in Georgia that were outward oriented. Again, typical of resource dependency. None of these organizations had particular resonance in Georgian society before the 2003 elections, when most citizens were more concerned with jobs and territorial integrity than they were with democracy per se. But they saw that Shevardnadze had lied his way into another electoral cycle, and that with him in power, they weren't going to have jobs, and their territory was going to continue to be threatened. And here we're talking about especially Abkhazia and South Ossetia.